Hi, everybody. My name is Mihir Wanchoo, and I am a part of Fantasy Book Critic. And today, joining me for another video interview is Matt Davis. We are here for the Fantasy Book Critic, authors and their favorite book series. And Matt has kindly agreed to join me at this early hour and talking about one of his favorite urban fantasy books. So a little bit about Matt. He was one of the participants in SPFPO 2020 or 2021 edition. And I would like to introduce him. Yeah, I would love him to introduce himself to you all. So there you go, Matt.
Hey, good morning, and thanks for having me here. My name is Matt Davis. I am the author of the weird occult urban fantasy series, Gray Days. My book from the SPFBO contest was Red Sky Blues, which was my first book ever. The series itself has actually just wrapped. The trilogy is completed as of this December. Other than that, I watch a lot of cartoons, I listen to a lot of music, and I do a lot of reviewing on my personal website and also for Grimdark magazine.
Awesome. So, I will be adding the links to his books and his website, as well as the Grimdark, all of his previous reviews down below, so you can all check it out. So Matt, can you tell us about the book that you have chosen to talk about today?
I wanted to talk today about one of my favorite books, and it's Sunglasses After Dark, which is part of the Midnight Blue collection by Nancy A. Collins. It's a very, very 90s example of urban fantasy. I like to consider it kind of like a time capsule. It's highly representative of the kind of, I guess, extreme edginess of the 90s and how everything was exploring the darker side of things, and anti-heroes were the biggest thing on the block. It's a lot different from the urban fantasy we have these days, especially considering urban fantasy these days seems primarily either towards cranky, sarcastic wizards or how many supernatural entities can the protagonist have sex with.
Yeah.
So
fair point. Now I want to talk to you. I want to ask you, was this your introduction to Nancy A. Collins's work, or did you find did you read something else and then come to this book?
It was the first Nancy A. Collins book I ever read. And it's what hooked me into it. It was, I found the Midnight Blue collection at the bookstore, and primarily the thing that dragged me to it was I saw the little emblem on the spine, which was White Wolf Publishing back in the day, which I've been a fanatic for almost my entire life now. And I saw that, I read it, and I had to have it. I had to read it. And I devoured that book, like the whole omnibus edition, which is, 4 inches thick, in like 3 or 4 days.
Wow.
And so ever since then, I've been a huge Nancy A. Collins fan, and I've tried to get my hands on everything she's ever read.
Awesome. Well, let's talk a little bit more specific about this book, because like you mentioned, this book has some darker edges. This book has, like you mentioned, it's kind of like the anti-hero. It kind of represents anti-hero culture, and it was kind of like the predecessor to before the urban fantasy boom of the early, I want to say the late 90s and the early 2000s, because we were then inundated with urban fantasy of every stripe. So I want to talk to you first about what makes this book special. Like, was it the setting? Was it the horror edges to it? Was it the protagonist who was basically a vampire trying to, retain edges of her humanity? I wouldn't even say her humanity. I just want to say edges of her humanity. So what was it?
It really was a combination of all of those elements. It was the fact that the world itself is our world, but our world is already terrifying, but then you add in the fact that there are literally monsters hiding everywhere. They look just like people, and you never know who it might be. You never know how horrible or crazy the world is going to get and how extremely violent it's going to get. And then there's just the way that Nancy writes. She has such a clarity of purpose in her writing. There's nothing superfluous to it. Everything about her writing, about her prose, is very raw. It's very direct. She doesn't waste time. She doesn't waste words. She's got a real penchant for action. it's fast paced, and I like fast paced. I hate it whenever any book wastes time. I don't have a lot of time, so I like it whenever I can start a book and things are happening. So whenever it came to Sunglasses After Dark and the Sonya Blue Chronicles, it kind of ticked all those boxes. The protagonist is someone who I was immediately responsive to because she's cool. She's cool as hell. And the world itself is frightening and fascinating, and there's a history to it, and the characters and the creatures in it are fascinating because they are drawn from mythology and folklore, but they all have a very unique spin on them. And then there is, of course, Sonya's personal inner conflict with her other, who's the vampiric part of her nature, which is constantly trying to destroy what remains of her humanity and take her over and cause her to do horrific, terrible things and get her to be a monster.
Wow. Okay. That does sound quite a lot. And like, it's kind of unique in itself because it doesn't sound like a typical urban fantasy book, like,
No.
I have to say this. I am still an urban fantasy fan, though I have outgrown my urge to jump at every urban fantasy book. But, this, like you mentioned, this was like way out. I think it was published in first 1988 or 89. That's when the first book came out. And then since then it has been, there's been 4 other books. It was kind of like complete as a series as well. But it isn't as popular, as the other ones are. Why do you think that is?
I think a lot of it has to do with distribution and marketing, unfortunately.
Okay.
Nancy A. Collins, despite the fact that she is an amazing writer, who also does amazing comic books, her Swamp Thing run is amazing. Her original publishers were like White Wolf. Mm-hmm. And unless you are big into White Wolf role-playing games, World of Darkness role-playing games and stuff like that, or are just really big urban fantasy and horror buff, you probably didn't see her work. And like I said, the only reason why I discovered her work is because I just happened to be in the section of the bookstore where the World of Darkness books were, and it was filed next to them. And I saw it and I grabbed it and I had to have it. And even to this day, whenever I mention Sonya Blue to other people, like 9 times out of 10, somebody who knows what I'm talking about, they also play the World of Darkness games. Mm-hmm. And so I guess it feels a lot like a misfire on the marketing. I think that if she would have landed with a bigger, more recognized publisher, she probably would be huge. She probably would be like, I don't know, a grittier, edgier, angrier Anne Rice by this point. But it never happened, especially considering like back in the early 90s, they did The Crow. Mm-hmm. They could have done a Sonya Blue movie and it would have, my God, it would have blown up. But
I know it's like another one of those what if scenarios as well. Like, what if this had happened? And it's funny, like you mentioned this, because I like how you describe her as like a dark, edgier Anne Rice, because Anne Rice was huge in the early 90s. Her, Interview the Vampire and all the Vampire Lestat books, they just kind of kept on growing and growing. And of course, we also have Laurel K. Hamilton, who kind of started out around the same time, and her, oh dear God, why am I forgetting hers? Anita Blake, I believe her.
Anita Blake
is her series name, and like I don't know, have you read them?
I tried. I really did. I think I got through the first book.
Okay.
And then I picked up the second one, and I had this hard rule that if I don't get grabbed by the 3rd chapter, I'm not going to waste my time anymore. Mm-hmm. And I think it was right around the 2nd or 3rd chapter that I said, yeah, this can't happen.
Well, you, sir, are a braver man than me. Yeah, sorry, go on.
Oh, no, I've heard what's happened with the series, and I'm glad I quit.
Oh, yeah. I actually gave up. Well, I didn't give up. I read until book 4, and I kind of got an inkling of where the series was going. It was okay. It wasn't bad. It was okay. It was kind of, heading more and more to the sexcapades. I don't know if we call it sexcapades, but it goes kind of heading that direction. I was like, okay, this is not really something that I enjoy. And then I just didn't look back. But of course, after that, it's like there's going off the wheels, and that series just jumped over the shark while going off the wheels, I believe. But it's popular. It sells a lot of books. I don't know what to say about that. And then, of course, we have the Dresden Files, which kind of, began like in the early 2000s, which, of course, now is a monster. And Jim Butcher is kind of considered the granddaddy of all urban fantasy. Have you read?
And I love the Dresden Files. I think I got into the Dresden Files right around the second or third book, and I've been following it kind of obsessively ever since. He is kind of, as far as modern urban fantasy goes, he is the high water mark. And it's not necessarily just because of his extreme popularity. He's really good at telling the kind of story that he tells. He does have certain sticking points to his writing. There are certain tropes of Butcher, which you got to wrap your head around and get used to, especially the way that he has a tendency of writing female characters. But they kind of say that's the noir thing. So whatever it is, what it is.
Yeah, I get what you're saying, because noir, when it began, with its roots in 1940s and 50s, the main protagonist was often had like a, if you want to call it, a chivalrous view, and Harry Dresden has that chivalrous view down pat. But it can be annoying. It really can be annoying. While, like, after I'll give like the first 4, 5, 6 books, it's okay, because he's stumbling his way. But after that, it just feels more and more annoying. And for me, I like Harry Dresden. I don't love him anymore. I don't know if you have the same feeling.
He's not my favorite character in the books.
Yeah. So. Who is your favorite character then?
That's rough. I really do, and I a lot of my favorite parts of Dresden are the side stories, and I've been desperately wanting them to do a Sonya side story, because the agnostic Knight of the Cross is a very cool concept to me, and he's just a fantastic character because he's a optimistic fatalist. I don't know, he's an awesome character. And beyond that, I guess Goodman Gray, he's one of the newer characters, and he's very cool.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I like, well, you know what, we'll save this discussion for later, because we are here to talk about Nancy A. Collins's book. One of the surprising things about Sunglasses After Dark was that it actually won the Bram Stoker Award. It also won the Icarus Award from the British Fantasy Society, basically for its horror edges. That was a huge deal, but yet, of course, the critical acclaim didn't translate to sales, and you kind of touched upon that, why that might be. I want to talk to you. I want you to maybe focus upon, or I want you to get your thoughts about the horror edges of this thing. What do you think?
It's got a lot of horror aspects to it. It's not just the fact that, there are vampires involved. There are versions of werewolves and demons and ghosts and stuff involved. I mean, those are all very obvious horror elements. The more intrinsic horror elements are the facts that one of the core themes is the way that humanity is very fragile, and not just humanity as a whole, like mankind, which is fragile because we are prey to this entire species of supernatural entities that are constantly hunting us, but the fact that at any time a person could lose their humanity, and the fact that Sonya herself is constantly warring with herself and trying to retain her humanity, and it's a very personal struggle. It's to crib a phrase from the World of Darkness books, it's a story of personal horror, the horror of losing yourself. And that's kind of the running theme that's a thread in every single one of the books, is that Sonya's constant struggle to retain her humanity and having to do horrific things on a regular basis and maintain some semblance of herself and not succumb to these monstrous desires and urges that she desperately does want to cave into. It's scary because there's a lot of times, I don't know, I deal with certain thoughts and feelings, I guess, personally, that whenever you see a protagonist dealing with these same kinds of things, you wonder for a minute, like, God, how easy would it be to, stumble in this situation? So it's kind of like a reflection of how easy it would be to fall.
That is a wonderful point that you bring up. That her writing is able to draw you in, and that you're able to get into that role, and kind of imagine yourself in that scenario as well. Now, I do want to talk to you about Sonya as a character, because, like you mentioned, she has to do horrific things, while trying to hold on to her humanity. And the way the book portrays the situation, because it has her go through some really dark stuff. And for our viewers, there's going to be some spoilers, obviously, because the book is about another 30 plus years old, so I'll spoilers as well. The way Sonia is turned into a vampire is described. It's brutal, it's graphic, and it's not for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe, what I'm trying to get to at is in the 90s and the early 2000s, maybe that was okay, or maybe people were not okay with it, but they wouldn't really raise their voices. But nowadays, with trigger warnings and with the concept of like, that you need to, there are certain things that you cannot write about. How would you think the reception would be? Or if maybe, let's say these books got popular again, how do you think the reception would be? While also considering that the author is a female writer.
It's a lot of it, like I said before, it was the Sonia Blue books are very 90s, and 30 odd years ago, we just didn't think about certain things. We didn't think about the repercussions of certain things. And a lot of it had to do with shock factor. A lot of it did kind of have to do with, we want to grab the reader by the throat and make them scared, make them have a reaction, whether or not it's a guttural reaction, or these days might even be considered an inappropriate reaction. And like you said, especially in the very beginning of the story, whenever you find out how Sonia is turned into a vampire, she completely is robbed of her agency. She has zero control over the entire situation. It's a horrific moment that's not really shied away from at all. You see the whole thing happen, and that these days would probably get some people worked up. Mm-hmm. And then there's a lot of other stuff that happens throughout the course of the entire series that's very similar to that. Agency and how quickly it can be taken from you is another theme of the book, of all the books, especially with Sonia struggling with with the vampiric part of her nature, which is it's an active part of her. It's a voice in her head. It's something that steals her control, that regularly, again, robs her agency from her, takes her self-control away, causes her to do things she does not want to do. Throughout her history in the books, she murders her friends and loved ones. She has no choice. She can't stop herself. It's a recurring theme, and it's horrific. It's terrible. And I think in the 90s, a lot of books dealt with stuff like that. I mean, my God, some of the stuff that happens in some of the earlier Anne Rice books, I don't know how well any of those would fly these days if they were released within the last 10 years. Like some of the Sleeping Beauty books, if you've ever read any of the stuff that she wrote beyond the vampire novels, it's insane, the crap that goes on in those books. But yeah, the 90s was a very special time. And I wonder if a lot of the stuff that we did that was very questionable was just to push boundaries and see what the reactions were going to be.
Interesting. That is definitely an interesting point, because, you definitely had a lot more violence in the movies as well. The 80s and 90s movies where, I mean, the R-rated versions were out there, but even like the what was supposedly PG-13 had a lot of blood and gore in it as well. You mentioned this fact, that the series kind of becomes bloodier and gorier as well. Have you finished the series? Like
the only one I haven't been able to read, and it breaks my heart that I haven't been able to, is the one that she just, I believe it was just a couple years ago, she funded it through Indiegogo or Kickstarter or something. Yeah, Kill City Blues or something like that. She has such amazing titles. Yeah, there was like the final Sonia Blue novel came out just a couple years ago, and I think the only way to have gotten it was like on an Indiegogo campaign or something like that. Okay. And so I'm really hoping at some point she decides to self-publish it or put it out through something. I believe it's on her Patreon, which I've really got to get on top of Patreon someday. But there are ways to get it. I just haven't been able to get to it yet. But as far as all of the traditionally published ones, I've read them all, and I think I have a tendency to reread them every few years. Those books are like comfort food.
All right. It's a darker comfort food, if you want to, if you to paraphrase you. But
Yeah.
ask you, what's your favorite book in the series? And what's your most, of the 5 books and the side stories that were released, the 3 side story books that were released, which one would be a favorite and why?
Honestly, and this is probably controversial to a certain subsect of the fans, my favorite Sonya Blue book is the World of Darkness tie-in spin-off, A Dozen Black Roses. Despite the fact that Nancy was published by White Wolf Publishing, she didn't do any writing for any of the role-playing game supplements or anything like that. But then all of a sudden, next thing you know, a book comes out and it's Sonya Blue in the World of Darkness. And so it was like, oh my God, my 2 favorite things have been smashed together. It's peanut butter and bananas. It's amazing. And it was an incredible book because she didn't quite fit in that setting because the rules of the world weren't quite the same, but it worked and it was amazing. And it was a cool story. It was just an amazing, very cool story because the World of Darkness, Vampire the Masquerade, Mage the Ascension, and all that stuff is just an incredible setting. And then all these years later, she rewrote that book to completely eliminate all of the World of Darkness elements. So that it's a 100% standalone Sonya Blue novel. So if you happen to have the original one that was released in the 90s, it's a rarity these days because you can't get it anymore without the original content in it.
So wow, so there's kind of like 2 stories out there, there. You can get the older version, you'll get like a World of Darkness, plus Sonya Blue story. But now, of course, the online versions there. I think they're re-released by Open Media, and I'll be linking those down below as well. Those are kind of like she's basically got the reins of the story back in her own, and she's kind of kept it. Have you ever found anybody else, or have you found another series like this one in the urban fantasy world that you have read so far?
I think the closest thing, I was trying to think about this before, urban fantasy that hits the same kind of unflinching kind of, I hate to say raw, but the closest thing I can honestly think of is Poppy Z. Bright's writing, who's another one of my all-time favorite writers. Poppy Z. Bright, now Billy Martin, and Nancy A. Collins are largely responsible for why I write what I write. And with Poppy Z. Bright, Billy Martin's writing, it was also dark urban fantasy, focused more on how horrific supernatural things affect the human side of things. The focus itself wasn't the supernatural. It just happened to be the supernatural intermingling with humanity. And they're gorgeously devastating books. The same kind of don't shy at all away from how awful things can get. But they're brutally effective, and the same kind of urban fantasy that, I don't know, fantasy almost seems like the wrong word, because they do deal with the fantastic in the regards that it is a supernatural version of our world. There are non-natural elements involved, like vampires and ghosts and monsters and such, but it has much more of a horrific lean to it.
That is interesting. So it's almost like it's kind of gothic, but it also basically doesn't supernatural, because almost all, like 90 to 95% of urban fantasy has kind of made the supernatural kind of cute, if you want to call it that. It's like there, and then you're discovering it slowly along. But you're mentioning Poppy C. Bright, and of course with Nancy Collins, like they don't really shy away from making it seem viscerally horrendous, because that's what the elements are. I want to ask you if you have heard or read Charlie Huston's, or Charlie Huston, I'm sorry, I'm mispronouncing his name, Joe Pitt books. Have you heard of them?
I've got to. That's another one on my monstrously ridiculous TBR pile. I keep throwing books onto it and saying I'm going to get to them someday, but I've heard a lot about them and it sounds a lot like something I need to get into.
They're like the perfect match, or like perfect combination of like noir and vampires is the only way I can put it. It's a 5-book completed series. It's each, and of course, like in each book kind of is like made to be standing on its own. But of course, the further you go along, there's events of the past books which kind of are like pulling more and more. They're coming to a conclusion. But they're dark, they're gritty, they're violent. I want to say they're less violent maybe than Sunglasses of Dark. I haven't read any of the other books, which is why I can only compare to this one, because the main character Joe Pitt versus Sonia Blue, I feel like Joe Pitt is kind of driven. I mean, he has more agency, so as to put, to use your terms, whereas Sonia does not because of certain events that are happening. Like, yeah, you should. I would be really curious to see how you find that.
Yeah, I've been slowly whittling away on my TBR pile, and I've also been trying to refine it into things that it's really hard for me to connect with books. I don't want to say that I'm picky, but I have, like I said, I have that 3-chapter rule. If I don't attach to something immediately within the first 3 chapters, I'm not going to wait for something to get good. It's my belief that a book should just be good. And I'm not going to apologize for not liking something. If I don't like it, I don't like it. I'll move on. I'm sorry. But those are definitely books that urban fantasy and stuff is probably my favorite genre. As much as I do love science fiction and I love traditional and epic fantasy and high fantasy, urban fantasy was really my first love. And so that kind of stuff is really where I'm most comfortable and where I tend to find the deepest connections.
Perfect. Well, just before just another session, have you heard or read Craig Schaefer?
No.
You might want to check him out. He mixes dark fantasy, he mixes noir and horror as well. And he's got multiple, basically it's like a Schaefer verse, so as to speak. It's mildly spoiler, but I think it should be okay. There's a series of books called Daniel Foss, which is on a con man set in Las Vegas. It sounds, tropey. It's not.
Good with tropes.
Yeah, but it's more of like the tropes are subtly done, so that way you kind of like, when you're looking back and like, oh, that's what he did. At least that's what happens with me. I'm a slow reader to catch on these things. There's Harmony Black, which is like an FBI hunting monsters. Again, sounds very common. It's not. It's a lot to that. And then there's something else as well. But like it's all kind of tied in, and you're slowly discovering this world. I feel like he's the Stephen King of the urban fantasy universe, but I don't want to call him the urban fantasy universe because it's like it's something more than that. But he's got huge elements of horror. He writes characters really well, and he does great food descriptions. I don't know if you're into that as well, but he does really, like, it'll rival George R. R. Martin's descriptions without using the same amount of space.
I don't want to call it a guilty pleasure because I don't believe in guilty pleasures. I think if you like something, you like something and don't have to make excuses. One of my favorite book series of all time is Brian Jacques' Redwall series. I grew up reading them. I still love them to this day. And one of the best things about those books is all the food descriptions in them. He goes nuts on food descriptions. So yeah, I'm into that.
Awesome. Well, you should definitely check Craig Schaefer out. I have a feeling you might enjoy it as well. All right. Before we wrap up this discussion, I want to talk to you quickly about your books as well. You mentioned that your Gray Day series is kind of ended. What are you planning to write about next?
Currently, I am writing a Martian horror story. It is a soft sci-fi. I am not technical enough to do anything hard sci-fi. I guess the easiest way to describe it would be kind of a mix between The Mummy, Mission to Mars, and At the Mountains of Madness.
Oh, wow. That sounds awesome.
Thanks. I've been slowly piecing it out. I actually started writing it like 5 years ago. And I finally, now that I've finished my series, I finally have the time and brain power to start working on it again in seriousness. It's kind of a passion project. It's very write the story you want to read kind of a thing, because the more that I think about it, it's like a marketable thing, like, God, where's this even going to go? Because it's very strange. I've actually been releasing bits and pieces of it on my website just as I'm going. But that's my current project, even though I actually have, going over my work in progress file, I think I have 7 current works in progress for some stupid reason.
That's okay. That's all you amazing writers. Everybody has a lot of ideas, and it's like finding the time to write them in. When can we see, is there a potential release date for this? Do you know when you can probably expect to finish it, or is it just still up in the air? Because it's a person.
I'm hoping to have it actually, at least as far as like the first draft, done within the next couple months.
Oh, okay, nice.
So if I don't suffer from any kind of burnout or madness, I should hopefully have it released by the end of this year. Hopefully.
Well, fingers crossed. You have a read, and
yeah.
I'm definitely wanting to jump up on that as well. For our viewers, can you perhaps also describe your Grey Days trilogy? Because like you mentioned, you know, it's finished, it's weird urban fantasy, it's out there. And I know a lot of readers are hung up on the fact that, you know, that they only will start or finish series. So for all of those who are, you know, who have that hang up, how can you describe your finished trilogy that is currently out there?
It does. I guess the best way to simply describe it is S.A. Hunt, the writer of the Malleus Domestica series, called the books the Dresden Files for the John Dies at the End crowd. So it does start with the trope of the cantankerous wizard. But from there, it is very divergent in the fact that basically the entire series is a study in escalation and how drastic can things continually get. It's one apocalypse after another, and sometimes multiple within the same book. The entire series is very highly interconnected. I wish I could say that they were standalone books, but they're not. You kind of got to start at the beginning and work your way to the end. They are small town, despite whereas like a lot of other urban fantasy wants to deal with big cities and, you know, metropolises and stuff like that. You've had like Chicago and London and I think San Francisco and stuff like that have always been major settings for urban fantasy because I guess monsters only live in big cities. Yep. Whereas Grey Days takes place in primarily a tiny little town in the middle of nowhere. So it's kind of got a Erie, Indiana vibe to it, where where do the monsters go to hide? What would they even be doing there? And what kind of, you know, it's kind of like if the monsters are getting up to as bad of things in places where you can see them, what are the monsters doing in the places you can't see them? So the main character, who is primarily greed motivated most of the time, he's not so much interested in saving the world as he is saving his own ass. So I guess he's got a bit of the morally gray there. And a lot of it has to do with just surviving to the next payday. But it escalates from there into, God, I guess I have to save the world now. Because if I'm going to survive, the world has to survive as well. And a lot of it has to do with internal conflicts and not necessarily the balance of power, but how bad having power can mess you up. Magic isn't a good thing. I mean, it can be a good thing, but just because you have magic doesn't mean it solves everything. It doesn't mean it fixes anything. And magic isn't often the best answer to a problem. Just because you could snap your fingers and make something happen doesn't mean that's the best course of action. And then there's also zombie pigs and cosmic gods of destruction and insane fallen angels and lots of just very weird stuff happening.
That sounds awesome. I'm probably going to start it later. I have the first 2 books in my TBR file as well. I'm going to start it later this year. All right. Well, Matt, thank you so very much. I'm so early today.
Thank you for having me.
No, it was really wonderful. For all our viewers, I'm going to be listing all of Matt's information down below, so you can check out his books and, you know, check out, you know, Nancy Collins's Sunglasses of the Dark. I'll be linking that to over here as well. So thank you so much once again, Matt. And
thank you, man.
Soon. Take care.